Yes. Yes. Ghost. We got the Space Jam Ghost Cup. Check it out. It's in the merch for Ghost. For a limited time, if you are a fan of space, if you're a fan of Star Talk, if you're a fan of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, check it out. Links in the bio. But no, I reacted to a Moist Critical clip recently, and I don't think I did a super deep dive into it because it was really late that night and I couldn't articulate myself. And despite the fact that it is earlier today, it's about midday. I'm also not going to go super deep because it's also Father's Day. Happy Father's Day, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm gonna probably get off here as soon as possible. But I was watching the original Neil deGrasse Tyson clip where he was responding to Terrence Howard on the Joe Rogan podcast. So I'm working my way up the stream because I reacted to a reaction. Now I'm reacting to his original response. I'm probably going to watch the original JRE episode at some point. I haven't seen it. It just, I think that there's some exciting ideas that are being discussed. And I really thought that Neil deGrasse Tyson would approach this in bad faith because, like, let's be honest, he's a showman. He's a showman. He's somebody who communicates science extremely well. But by the very same token, he will constantly interrupt you to make his point. And he makes a far grander point and a far more illustrated point. So I understand his tendency to want to interrupt you because he's going to make your point better than you can. I get that. I get that. It's just very frustrating to hear it real time on a podcast. But I love consuming the things that he creates. So I have this mixed feeling about Neil deGrasse Tyson. I love his background. I love the way his mind works, and I love the illustrations that he makes. But at the same time, I just can't stand the way he interacts with people. But I mean, that's what you expect in science. A lot of scientists aren't really good at talking to people. They're more interested in speaking about ideas rather than interacting with a person who may not understand their ideas. They dive deep into the details, and most people don't like to hear about the details. So we're like hermit crabs like that, you know, where it's like we're sort of by ourselves. We're like, you know, the brown recluse, right? We're like the brown recluse, where we're just like in the corner, just waiting. We don't like other spiders. We're just by ourselves, and we're like, we can be pretty toxic sometimes. I'm not gonna lie. That's just what that is. But at the same time, in a vacuum, he can create something insanely incredible. And I am a huge fan of his show Cosmos. Not the biggest fan of Star Talk. I will sometimes tune in, but it's just, I mean, listening to him interact with people is just so frustrating. But yeah, so I was watching it this morning, and I figured, you know what, it's probably best if I actually play his original. If I actually play his original video. I think that that's a more fair response to Neil than reacting to a Moist Critical clip of it. So this is what I was watching. I'm gonna check on a YouTube channel to make sure I'm actually broadcasting this. My name is Labdominals. I have a podcast. It's called Labdominals Podcast. Neil deGrasse Tyson fan. Okay, cool. So it is streaming. It is on. A lot of times in the past, it's broadcast a black box. It's just been like nothing at all, and I don't know what that is. So it's now become my habit to check that before I start playing these things. But this is Neil deGrasse Tyson, and yes, the title to this is pretty silly, but I thought it was funny.
I recently learned I got name checked by Terrence Howard on his recent appearance on Joe Rogan.
I reached out to Neil deGrasse Tyson. he was like, hey man, yeah, I'd love for you to come on my show, do my radio, do my TV thing. Would love that. I was like, yeah, but I've got something I want to introduce to you.
I got name checked because 8 years ago, he sent me a 36-page treatise.
And it was only 36 pages.
So this is Terrence Howard
Ridiculous.
attempting to reinvent mathematics and physics. A little backstory there. I took initial interest in Terrence because my mother said to me, do you know Terrence Howard? I said, yeah, I know. You mean the actor? She said, yeah. Well, I heard him interviewed on NPR. On there, he said that like when he was a kid, he wanted to be like a scientist and study the universe. I said, well, that's cool. Okay, maybe we'll get him on Star Talk. We love talking to celebrities who have a soft geek underbelly. At the time, I didn't quite know how to get in touch with him, but we met at something called the Upfronts, which is where networks present their next season's TV shows.
I saw him at an event
By the way, if you're watching this back, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that are being discussed here, but if you're watching this back and you're a little bit annoyed by having, like, say, the title here and the channel, I can fix that. I can do full screen. I don't want to do that because I want it to be known what video I'm watching and who actually made it. And also, like, what the view count was at the time when it was made. Like, this was made 3 days ago, so this is still relatively new. This is like fresh on their channel. How many likes they have. I think all of that information is really important because I didn't make this content. I'm never going to monetize this content because I didn't make it. I think that that's a stance that I've made very clear in the past, and it's something that I'm always going to stand by. But I really, really, really want to make people know this is not my content and where they could find this content. So I just want to be clear about that.
front.
And then this came in my inbox. In this particular case, since I basically solicited it from him, I actually spent time reading every line of all 36 pages. And I commented. My comments are in red here. You see that? So I spent a lot of time on it. And I thought, out of respect for him, what I should do is give him my most informed critical analysis that I can. In my field, we call that a peer review. You come up with an idea, you present it either at a conference or you first write it up, and you send it to your colleagues.
This is actually very true. This is very true. Not only true is this is not only true in academia. This is very, very true in industry as well. Even in industry, like, we will check each other's work. Like, you need to have somebody else look at your work before you submit it. This usually operates by a different department. It's good to have that as far removed as possible. So we submit that to a different department called data review. And we have a ton of issues with data review because I don't think that they're scientific at all with their approaches. They're more historically based, but still, this is a very, very common practice, especially in academia, but we also see it in my field as well.
It is their duty to alert you of things about your ideas that are either misguided or wrong, or there's the calculation that doesn't work out, or the logic doesn't comport.
Or unethical.
That's their job. Not all ideas will turn out to be correct. Most won't be. But to get to that point, you need to know things like, what has everyone else said about this same subject? Am I repeating someone else's work? Is this a new insight that no one else has had, but has foundations that are authentic or legitimate or objectively true? Am I making a false assumption? Am I making an assumption that someone else has already shown to be false? All of this goes on the frontier of science. Let me make it clear that I'm delighted when I see people with active minds trying to tackle the great unknowns in the universe.
That sentence right there really drove me wanting to react to this, because I had an initial opinion about Neil deGrasse Tyson and how he will typically see a movie and be like, oh, that's nonsense because of X, Y, and Z theorem. And I've seen him dismiss things outright for seemingly thoughtless. He has seemingly thoughtless responses, and he's just pointing to old information. Oh, well, given this, that, and the other thing, this is not true. And, like, fair enough. You can base things off of historical research like that. You should. As a scientist, you should. But I thought he would approach this differently. I really thought that he would say like, well, everybody thinks this, like, why are you going against the grain, sort of a thing. Just like the blasé response that I typically see with people that Penguin Zero had, right? I love Charlie. I love Charlie. He's a great YouTuber, but he still fell victim to this mentality that we see when people say, well, everybody knows that this is the case. This is common knowledge, this, that, and the other. I hate those arguments. I hate those arguments so much because it robs people of the ability to think through a subject. Even given incorrect premises, you are supposed to generate the incorrect answer that's obviously false, that tells you I've started with incorrect premises. It robs you of the entire intellectual pursuit if you say, oh, well, everybody else doesn't think this, so therefore it's not true, because that's not logical. That's not logical. And the fact that Charlie said that, well, he didn't say exactly that, but the fact that Charlie held that sort of sentiment in his words was really disheartening to me, because I love watching his stuff. But when he comments on science, I think that he just doesn't have that perspective. That's totally fine. He's not a scientist. I get it. But Neil is. Neil is a scientist. And when he said this, I think it really changed my opinion on his perspective of this, because he's showcasing his love for the intellectual pursuit, the thing that I'm describing here. When you say something like this is the product of a very active mind that is approaching this subject from incorrect premises, that's okay. That is an absolute okay perspective to have. And the thought process of going through, well, if given A and given B, then it therefore follows C, D, E, and F. He's saying that is a noble pursuit, and he's glad that this person has this active mind that wants to go through that logical process. I'm super happy to see that. I'm really, really happy to see that, because that really differentiates somebody from being just a showman, just somebody who presents the data and hides behind their degree, or hides behind the studies, the walls of studies. That studies can be loaded in such a way they can offer incorrect conclusions if you are not analyzing it appropriately. Garbage in equals garbage out. We all say that. So when he said this, I really wanted to show my love and isolate this specific part of the video and say that this is really, really important, particularly in science. The whole this viewpoint. This separates the real from the fake, in my opinion, the wheat from the chaff. In science, this is the differentiating factor. If you just hide behind your degree or a wall of studies and you just continuously say, well, we don't have enough data, and you don't use your mind to think through things, in my opinion, you are not a true scientist, because you are not using the scientific method. You are a historian. You're a scientific historian who's posting old information, right? You don't have the scientific toolkit to parse through that information and determine what is good and what is bad, and classify and clade information and understand what leads to the cascades that you're observing. You don't have that ability if you can't parse through these things. Neil is isolating that specific thing that I find absent in my field often, and it makes me so frustrated. So I absolutely love that Neil is saying this right now, because he is on point.
It's a beautiful thing that people want to participate on this frontier. What can happen is, if you're a fan of a subject, let's say, a hobbyist, let's call it, it's possible to know enough about that subject to think you're right, but not enough about that subject to know that you're wrong. And so there's this sort of valley in there, a valley of false confidence. This has been studied by.
Yeah. I'll even admit that in my own life. I think I feel less confident about my knowledge in science after my master's degree than after my bachelor's degree. because you approach it so like, well, I have my degree in this, so like I do know something about it. And then you approach these subjects in your master's degree and you're like, oh my gosh, like I don't know much of anything at all when it comes to this subject. Like obviously you know things like carbocations and like, you know, like let's say for example, like there's this displacement of a methyl group, right? And then it creates this carbocation, and then that's going to create like a racemic mixture of stereoisomers, right? Like let's say that, for example, that concept, it's pretty straightforward, but then you get into the concept of like, oh, okay, well, this displacement does happen, but where does the hydrogen go? And then you're thinking, well, sterically, it should go one way. It's either like Markovanov or anti-Markovanov, but you're thinking through this and you're like, oh, well, sterically, you would want to do like Markovanov or something. And then the instructor's like, no, this is an exception to the rule. And you're like, oh my gosh, I know nothing. Like that sort of scenario, right? Where it's just like a very, very specific thing. And you know, like the general rule, and somebody's like, well, no, because this is an exception. And so it's stuff like that where you're like, oh, well, I know about 80% of it, but that's barely a B. So like I start to encounter situations where it's like, wow, I don't know this completely as much as I thought I did. And then you get less and less confident as you learn more. You know, the more I see, the less I know. Smash Mouth, no. The more I see, the less I know. Red Hot Chili Peppers nailed that one.
Others, and it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's the phenomenon where a little bit of knowledge, you over-assess how much of that subject you actually know. And then when you learn even more, you realize, no, I didn't know as much as I thought I did. So then there's a sort of a lull there. And then
this is a great infographic. I use this often, by the way. I'd say your freshman year, maybe your sophomore year is when you're at this peak. And maybe bachelor's is about like right, maybe midway here. Like you're not as confident as you thought you were when you began it, but like you're like, oh yeah, I guess I really don't know much. And then this is like the beginning of your master's program where you're like, I clearly don't know as much as I thought I did. This is really getting hard. And then I'd say the slope of enlightenment, that's probably where I'm at now. It's probably like the same point of maybe a little less than when I graduated from my bachelor's. And then this would be like your doctorate over here, where it's like, you know what, I do kind of know this stuff.
When you learn even more, you come back up. Ultimately, learning enough to know whether you were right or wrong. To become an expert means you spend all this time. It doesn't happen overnight. You can't just sit in an armchair and say, I'm now an expert. It requires years and years of study, especially looking through journals where new ideas are published and contested. That's what we have learned is the most effective means of establishing that which is objectively true or determining that which is objectively false. Both of those work hand in hand to move the needle on our understanding of the universe. I'm going to read you just my opening line here. It's titled One.
Oh, yes. And this opening line is great. It's great. I think this is about as far as I made it in before I was like, I got to record this. I got to speak on this. Just because I've spoken about it before, and I want to provide additional clarity as to where exactly I stand on this.
Times 1 equals 2. So I lead off by saying, this is an ambitious work that is a clear indication of a restless, active mind.
I love that. I love that. That is the most important line in this entire critique, because he clearly states in the first line his intention behind making this peer review. He immediately starts off with, this is an ambitious work. That is a clear indication of a restless and active mind. Nobody writes 36 pages if they're like, well, yeah, I think differently, but like, no, it's not, if somebody has a restless mind, they can't help but stay up till 3 a.m. to write on these subjects that everybody else doesn't agree with. He says that this is an ambitious work because it stands directly in the face of all of our knowledge on this subject. It's ambitious because it is so far removed from anything that we collectively have created. It's ambitious because it seeks to engage in a logical process that we love as scientists. And if you don't love that process, you may have the degree, but you are not a scientist. I'm sorry, but I deeply respect people like this who can say something as astronomically stupid as 1 times 1 is equals 2. I respect somebody like that who's willing to engage in 36 pages of detailing exactly why they would come to that conclusion based on these premises, going through this logical stream. I respect that so far deeper than somebody who can just point to a couple books and say, well, it's true because X, Y, and Z person said that, and they hold degrees at this institution or that institution. That is all bullshit. That is all bullshit. Any appeal to authority is absolute bullshit. So somebody willing to start from any premise and engage in the thoughtful, logical process is a scientist in my mind. So this is an ambitious work that's a clear indication of a restless, active mind. That is the most important line.
Within these pages, however, there are many assumptions and
Yes.
statements that are underinformed, misinformed, or simply false.
Yes. So that's what he's saying. There are many assumptions. The beginning premises that you start with are the assumptions that you make, assuming the world is a globe, right? Like you would say things like that. And then people say, well, you're beginning with false premises, right? That is a logical argument. You are beginning with incorrect logical premises. You have to start with a certain set of premises that we all agree on. And if you can't agree on definitions, if you can't agree on premises, then we don't come to the same conclusion. And that's the error in the logical process. It's far more important to go through the logical process and say, oh, there's a flaw here. This is a unique flaw that I've never seen before, because then you can identify the flaws in your own thinking that say, well, actually, I've made that flaw before. I've actually made that flaw before. And I use it in this theory. And if I just, if I remove that flaw, then it actually creates a more correct conclusion in this other theory that I have it in. This is really important. It's the difference between somebody who talks about cars as just brands of cars. Oh, that's a Corvette. It's a Ford. It's a BMW. Like, it's the difference between somebody who's just talking about the brands and the mechanic that says, oh, well, there's this alternator that actually rotates in a different way using this differential. It's the mechanism of it all. It's the inner workings, the gears, the small gears inside of this logical machine that they are pointing to and dissecting and saying, actually, this gear is cut in such a way that the groove doesn't match the inner splicing, where it doesn't actually create the rotation. It's that level of detail, surgical precision of looking at the actual working of the logical machine, and then separating that, delineating that process from somebody that goes, oh, well, BMW does a great job with their alternators. No one cares. Like, when you say that aspect, no one gives a shit. Like, it doesn't matter what this person did. Like, BMW is a huge company that owns a tremendous amount of property. And you could point to them as a source of authority and say, well, BMW uses this. So, like, like it doesn't matter. Like if BMW makes it, or if Ford makes it, or if Mercedes Benz makes something, like they're all huge companies and they all do things very differently, right? Like Porsche has it in the fucking back, right? Like they're both huge companies. You can't point to one and say, well, that's a huge company and they do it this way, therefore it's correct. That's not logical. So I want to say that his pursuit here is extremely, extremely important to identify and isolate. And I think that it invokes a good conversation for all of us to have,
thereby compromising or nullifying many of the subsequent conclusions you have drawn.
Yes.
That's exactly what should happen in a peer review out of respect for one another's intellect. It opens with a quote from Terence. It can never occur that the square root of a given number, when added to itself, is greater than the initial number squared.
Let's sit on that for a second, because I don't understand that on its face. It can never occur that the square root of a given number, when added to itself, is greater than the initial number squared. So I think this is a hard beginning, a hard launch, if you will. So I think that this is a hard launch because most people can't conceptualize what a square root is. A square root is looking at a square of a certain area. What is the length of one side? That's the way to view a square root. The square root is to say, what is the root that you are squaring? So if you have let's say a box, you have a box of area 4. Very easy to conceptualize. You know, you have a box of 4. So you have 1 box, 2 box, 3 box, 4, right? What is one side of that square? It's 2 squares. The square root of 4 is 2 because the root that you are squaring is 2 boxes. So 2 squared is 4. That's what a square root is. It's very hard for people, even people with a good grasp of what a square root is, to conceptualize in the moment the square root. It's like even somebody like me who can go through that explanation, which most people can't give you, by the way, but to go through that explanation and to say, okay, so let's think through this for a minute. Square root. Given that the square root of a given number, when added to itself, is greater than the initial number squared. There's a lot of like walking around in this statement. So let's take, for example, the 4, right? So it can never occur, he says, that when the square root of a given number, let's say 4, the given number is 4, when added to itself, so 4 plus 4 is 8, is greater than the initial number 4 squared. 16. I honestly don't understand what this is almost like an example of a poorly worded math problem. Like you ever get a math book and you're working through the problems in the back and you're trying to figure out even what the question is asking you to begin with. Like it's one thing to be able to take the statement, transcribe that into an equation, and then struggle with trying to solve that equation. That's one aspect of doing homework, right? It's an entirely different issue to look at the words and say, I don't even know how to begin to transcribe this sentence into an equation. it's so far removed from my concept of reality that I truly don't know how to represent this mathematically. I think that's the point. I think that's the point. I think the point is to weed out the people that are so used to operating mathematics in a certain way. Like, I have no idea what this is trying to get at. It can never occur that the square root of a given number, when added to itself, is greater than the initial number squared. So 4 square root is 2 of a given number when added to itself. So 2 plus 2 equals 4 is greater than the initial number 4 squared, 16. I don't think that that's like, I mean, the example that I chose, I think fits that mold. I think it fits that mold because the equation I just walked through checks out, but I don't know what the consequence of that is. So he says it can never occur. It can never occur. I don't think that, I mean, that's definitive language, and mathematics is fairly definitive. Not gonna lie, 1 plus 1 is always gonna equal 2, except I don't know, maybe Terrence has a different opinion on it. But um, if you plug the numbers in to the calculator and it's calculating in the same way, the same input calculated in the same way will always result in the same output. That is true. That is true. So it's not to say that 1 plus 1 is always going to equal 2. Like, you could say that, obviously, that's common knowledge, right? But I think it's far more accurate to say, given the same input and the same calculation, you will always return the same output. So that takes away all different definitions of that term. So if you say 1 plus 1 always equals 2, well, how do you define 1? How do you define plus? How do you define equals? Like, so plus, equals, those are all operators. Those are they do math. They're all operators that do the math. And then the inputs are like the 1 and the 1. So for each input calculated or operated upon in the same way, so 1 plus 1 is always going to return the same output too, right? Like that, if you strip away our nomenclature of that, that is what it results in. That's the statement that you would make to be most correct about this idea. So I'm not sure exactly where he's going with it, but I will say that sometimes things cross the boundary of 0, right? For example, the sum of all positive integers will return negative 112, which is the area underneath the curve of the negative portion of that curve, right? It's just like, it's things like that.
For that would expose a loose thread within the fabric of our understanding, a loose thread capable of unraveling the very ground rules of mathematics. That's a bold statement. So then I just say, this opening thesis is false. Yeah. There are plenty of examples of this that have escaped your attention. His statement is shown to be false for every number that's less than 1 and greater than 0. For example,
I thought he would go through this because you could, if you represent this as an equation and then solve for the instances wherein this is false, you can identify a series of false you can identify a series of variables that would not meet this criteria. So
the square root of 0.64 is 0.8. 0.8 is bigger than 0.64. And it's
yeah. So this is what I'm talking about when you cross the threshold of 0. So any number less than 1. Okay. So any fraction. So we could have said any positive integer and would have been correct. And that's what I'm saying when it comes to things like the sum of all positive integers will result in negative 112, like something like that, right? You bring that into you bring certain concepts into the realm of fractions or the realm of imaginary numbers, things start to get really wonky really fast, and they don't intuitively fit the mold. Like, when somebody says dividing by a fraction will result in a multiplication, right? Like it's dividing by a fraction will result in multiplication of the reciprocal, right? Like it's very sorry. I don't think what I said was entirely true, but um what I'm trying to get at is there are things where it's like, well, if you take like half of a pizza and then you divide it amongst like three friends, you end up with more pizza. Like that doesn't make sense. Or no, I think it was more like if you take a fraction of the pizza and then you divide it, and then you divide that amongst a fraction of the people at your place, you end up with more pizza somehow. Like it there's certain applications of like dividing by a fraction that you're like, Why would that make sense? That doesn't make sense." Because it's not intuitive, but it's not supposed to be applied in that way, you know? In my opinion, I think the units on that problem are probably false, and that's what makes that not intuitive. But anyway,
a larger number than the original. And 0.64 squared equals 0.4096, a smaller number than the original, to the extent that the next 35 pages depends on your stated thesis. This fact undermines your claims and assumptions and conclusions.
yes.
It's not about feelings here. It's about objective reality. So at the time, I
Whoa, hold up, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Are you agreeing with Ben Shapiro? Are you saying that facts don't care about your feelings? Neil, you freaking Republican. Look at you.
Terrence a strong acquaintance, and we hung out a bit and had much exchange. We haven't spoken much since then. But go to page 2, and in here, he mentions people who he declares were persecuted because their vision exceeded the myopic view of their contemporaries.
I would like to take a few moments to thank all the pioneers that have free thinking forged way for all the seekers of truth. That's all like he's bloviating. That's just fluff. Their uncompromising devotion to the higher standard and pursue. Oh, that's the acknowledgement section. So obviously it's going to be in there. That's my bad. In the pursuit of knowledge, wisdom, understanding, discernment, insight, and reasoning, all great things, along with a deep appreciation for the eternal beauty that exists in all things, facts, many were persecuted because their vision exceeded the myopic, so myopic being like self-obsession, the lens of self-obsession, or like self-focused focus view of their contemporaries. Their vision exceeded the myopic view of their contemporaries. I'm not going to lie. I mean, many scientists do, well, I wouldn't call them scientists, but many people that operate in science that call themselves scientists that don't interact with the scientific method, they do have a fairly myopic view. They certainly have a fairly myopic view, but I feel like that is not Neil deGrasse Tyson, you know?
And he mentions Walter Russell, Nikola Tesla, John Keeley, and many, many more.
Let's go back for a second. Nevertheless, they push through it, and we, the children of men, are the beneficiaries of their brave sacrifices. Yeah, but Nikola Tesla, he was a fairly intuitive guy that understood mathematics at its deepest core. He was definitely persecuted. He was definitely not given his due as far as a true scientist. I mean, there's no scientist that's like the most true encapsulation of a scientist outside of Nikola Tesla. Like, that guy is the most persecuted scientist that only operated in the field of science. But I guarantee that he did not use these premises to come to those conclusions. I actually don't know Walter Russell and I don't know John Keeley, so I might have to do some more digging. But I will say that Nikola Tesla definitely did a great job of exceeding the myopic view of his contemporaries.
And he mentions Walter Russell, Nikola Tesla, John Keeley, and many, many more. Regarding your list of people who have made brave sacrifices, I note that to be a genius is to be misunderstood, but to be misunderstood is not to be a genius. The work of Walter Russell, has eluded any experimental support, and the work of
Russell has eluded any experimental support. Okay, yes, you definitely need experimental support. There might be people that just don't want to do your experiment, and there might be experiments that are outside the purview of science or outside the possibility of physics, right? Can you go outside of our atmosphere and go deep into space and take a picture or a photograph of Earth and prove the flat Earth's wrong, right? Can you do that? Yes, you could. You certainly could. It's real expensive to get up there, though, and good luck getting the photographs through the radioactive space, right? It's going to be very difficult. Going to be very, very difficult. But yeah, go ahead and try. That's an example of like an experiment that we could do, but is extremely outside of the possibility economically. And so you could have things that only like very expensive experiments would support, and people just don't want to fund you. Like, so yeah, I mean that's true, but it also has to be built upon like experiments that have been conducted that then therefore conclude what you want to do your experiment on. I think that would give you a great grant proposal. And the work of Keeley is not generally reproducible. Okay, that's fair too. Oh, that's fair. That's a fair criticism. If you can't reproduce a finding, if you're like, hey, I saw this given these conditions, and I did this, that, and the other thing, and this other person says, I did exactly this, that, and the other thing under these conditions and did not get that same result, that is a fair criticism. It's to say, like, well, something obviously must have been wrong with my calibration or your calibration or my standard or your standard. Something doesn't work out. But if I can't do the same thing that you just did, then there must be something wrong with the method, or there must be something wrong with the science itself.
Keeley is generally not reproducible. Science is about reproducibility. Yes. I can have the most brilliant, crazy, fun idea ever, and if I perform an experiment and no one else can duplicate that experiment, it belongs in the trash heap. It's me in my own world, thinking I have landed on an objective truth.
Yes.
When in fact I haven't. That's how science works. The reproducibility of results. As for the work of Tesla, much of it had very real value to physics and our understanding of electromagnetism. And that value is duly recognized by my community in the naming of a unit of electromagnetism after you. You can't get more badass than having a unit named after you.
Thank you, Neil. I explained that to so many people that are like, well, Nikola Tesla isn't given his due. He was not given his due back in the day. He really wasn't. He was extremely underrated. He has produced a tremendous amount of good for all of humanity. It puts us leaps and bounds above where we would be otherwise. The thing I'm speaking into right now is a direct connection to Nikola Tesla. He created so much good for this world. But after the fact, yes, they named the unit of magnetic field strength after Tesla. The unit of the magnetic field strength is a Tesla. That is the biggest thing that you could get, a unit of measurement named after you, right? That's awesome. I love that.
Newton has a unit named after him.
He sure does. He sure does. Forced his way into that one.
For example, the metric
force equals MA.
Unit of force is a Newton. Much of the rest of his work was fringe and unrealized, either for violating known laws of physics or for being simply...
Much of the rest of his work was fringe and unrealized, either for violating the known laws of physics or for being simply impractical? Interesting. I find this interesting because it's fringe, and it's got to be fringe because if you are operating on the border of reality, like you should be as a scientist, you should be operating on the border, and people will call you crazy, they'll call you a kook, and they'll call you all kinds of names, like Einstein was, for example. And then they try to prove you wrong, and they end up proving you right. Time and time again, they prove you right. And they're like, okay, that was a fluke. And they prove you right again. And they're like, oh, well, that's weird. And then they prove you right once more. And they're like, okay, we might have to revise our opinion on this. They don't believe you outright. And I understand that. So working on the fringe is to be a scientist. I don't think that that's a criticism. I don't think that that's a criticism at all. Unrealized, maybe, because he created so many different things later in life that seemingly were from a product of pure imagination. But this is a person with an extremely good grasp on the very real laws of physics. So when he's saying it violates the known laws of physics, I wonder if there was a conclusion that he drew from his mind that we don't know yet. That would be very interesting to me. Simply being impractical, sure. You can create ideas that are grandiose, that will never be realized in reality, basically because it's way too expensive. Like flying out to the outer edge of our atmosphere and taking a photo of Earth, right? To prove that it's a globe. You can do that. It's extremely grandiose and extremely impractical, but you could do that. It's just impractical in an economic sense. No one's going to pay for you to be up there, so you got to pay your own way. And is it really worth all that to do that for you for something that's extremely inconsequential?
Impractical. Just because you do some good stuff doesn't mean everything you ever did is going to be great. I will further affirm that just
right, 100%. That would be an appeal to authority. I totally agree with Neil.
Because an idea sounds crazy doesn't make it wrong. The system of research and publications in peer-reviewed journals has the capacity to spot crazy but true ideas.
Publications in peer-reviewed journals has the capacity to spot crazy but true ideas, provided that they are supported by compelling arguments. Yes, yeah, that's exactly it. It also has the capacity to do the exact opposite. I want that to be known very clear. If you come online and you were like, hey, I've got this crazy idea that if we do this, that, and the other thing, we could cure cancer. And then somebody looks at that and they're like, well, I have a massive stake in this radiology company, and I'm the peer review for this research. I'm just going to say that it's outright wrong and shoot it down because I have my own personal biases. You could do that. You could do that. What stops you from doing that? I think that there's always going to be bias in science. It's your duty as a true scientist to identify what those biases may be and combat them. So to say, hey guys, I actually have a huge stake in this radiology and oncology company that would go under if these given premises were true and these results were proved to be correct. So I'm going to step back and pass this off to another person who can approach this in a less biased manner. That would be the most appropriate way to conduct yourself as a scientist. I don't think anybody has the ability to do that, especially if your child's college fund is banking on the fact that this argument is wrong. I myself have stocks in science. So if you want to tell me that that's not possible, or if a scientist doesn't make enough money, I will assure you, scientists make a tremendous amount of money, and yes, they have stocks in these companies. I have stocks in these companies. Yes, I make a lot of money. Like that is, I know that to be true because it is my reality. Like you don't come at me with this isn't possible because I know it's true.
Provide.
Not to say that I would approach it in this way. I would never. But I'm a person of moral character, and I don't think I don't think that's needed in science. I don't think that people. I don't think we vet out people that have a poor moral backbone. That's not a requirement to be a scientist, or at least graduate with a degree. So, we got to be careful. We got to be careful and identify biases when they exist. And I would eliminate myself from these situations if I were in them. But I operate under the ethical guidelines that I have imposed on myself. So that's extremely self-reporting.
They're supporting by compelling arguments, and ultimately supported by experiments and observations. Newton's laws, Einstein's relativity, quantum physics were all revolutionary ideas that appeared in peer-review settings or journals. Meanwhile, most of the work of Russell and Keeley had no such success with their ideas. So I think on Rogan, Terrence said that I trashed those.
I don't like the way you said Rogan. I'm just going to say it. I have a bias. Let me just name my biases really quick, okay? Back in the day, and I explained this in earlier broadcasts, but let me explain it further. So I was a huge Joe Rogan podcast listener way back in the day. I have the earliest recordings I have of me downloading the Joe Rogan podcast were for 2011. That's when I have screenshots. I think I listened in early 2010 though, because I think I have tweets of posting about Joe Rogan's Ustream back in the day. So I'm a very, very old Joe Rogan fan. I have been for about, was it 14 years at this point? I would say about 14 years. So I'm coming up on like 1.5 decades of being a fan of Joe Rogan. So I have consumed a tremendous amount of podcasts from the JRE, especially back when it was fringe, when it was really, really weird to be listening to podcasts. I would listen to them all the time while I'm mowing the lawn or playing Minecraft. Whatever I was doing, I'd put on a podcast and I would laugh so hard because these comedians were thinking in the exact same way that I was. I was like, oh my God, these are my people. I'm like people that can't help but think of the wrong thing. That it's so funny to me. Like that I thought that I was like crazy because I would always think in this way. And then I listened to these comedians and I thought, oh my gosh, like I'm not alone. These are my people. I just need to get better at doing that thing and lean into it. So, I mean, I think that's really all it comes down to. But sorry, I want to be transparent about my love for Joe Rogan. Now, I haven't watched this episode because I've been on a Joe Rogan lull for a bit. I've taken a step back from compulsively watching Joe Rogan. But I will say that watching his podcast has definitely changed my life. Watching the people on his podcast like Tim Ferriss. Joe Rogan led me into listening to Tim Ferriss, and listening to Tim Ferriss has single-handedly, or not single-handedly, but played a huge role in changing my life for the better. So yeah, listening to his podcast had a very, very positive impact on my life, how I articulate myself, how I guide myself as a person who's interested in science. I maybe wouldn't have gotten into science had I not explored a lot of scientists on the Joe Rogan podcast. I started to only listen to guests that were doctors in their field. It was like, oh, these people really, really know what they're talking about, and I want to learn as much as possible. And I started reading their books and listening to audiobooks of those people that were featured. So huge fan, have been for a while, and I understand the huge positive impact that he's had on my life. Neil deGrasse Tyson was one of the first guests on the Joe Rogan podcast that I saw and was like, oh my gosh, he's really getting somebody from pop culture. It's not just comedians that are coming on. It's not just like a fringe guest that's talking about the pyramids. I'm sorry. I love you. I love you. But it's somebody from pop culture that has a TV show. This is really interesting. I think this podcast is getting really big. So I'm a very long time listener, and listening to Neil have this like sort of vitriol with Joe is just like it's a little frustrating. And I think most of that frustration comes from the fact that he consistently interrupts him, and Joe gets visibly upset because he can't help but interrupt Joe all the time.
Review settings or journals. Meanwhile, most of the work of Russell and Keeley had no such success with their ideas.
True.
So I think on Rogan, Terrence said that I trashed those three researchers.
Okay, I listened back to it. I don't think it was that bad, but I think it was just the pause and the blink that was just like, that was telling for me. I don't think it was as dramatic as I read it initially.
Attack that I had talked about Walter Russell and Victor Schauberger and John Keeley and Tesla as the people that I looked up to. So he threw shit on he was like, well, Tesla stuff worked, but Tesla was never really respected and out there.
When I'm just simply stating the fact, I don't think of that as trashing. I think of that as being honest.
Yeah, no, he didn't trash him at all. He didn't trash him at all. The only thing that he said was his later ideas were fringe and violated laws of physics. I think that's like provably correct. I don't think anything that he said was trash. You could say that those ideas ought to be discarded because they don't apply to the laws of physics or are fringe, but he didn't say that. He didn't say the consequence of that classification. He just said that those ideas are fringe. Do with that what you will. I play with the idea of flat Earth all the time, but that's not because I believe in the idea. That's not because I truly believe in this concept. I play with that idea because it is fringe. Like, I don't think that needs to be discarded because it's fringe. I think that it's a funny thing to bring up. I don't know. I don't agree with that conclusion drawn from that perception.
I mean, I could have softened it, but I don't think that's what people who care about you should do. People who care will be honest with you about ideas, about thoughts. The world is changing so quickly, and so is everything around us. Unfortunately, we have chosen to remain handcuffed to antiquated and obsolete beliefs. We have put an enormous amount of faith into the methods and practices of old that are as dead today as the men who propagated the notion that the world was flat.
I don't know why. I have this tendency to say these things and then watch it real time transpose, like to play out in such a like, I was just talking about this subject, about flat Earth, and then it just shows up like that. It's very interesting. It's very vindicating to me.
So I say here, regarding your world was flat reference, it's not widely appreciated that the idea of a flat Earth predates the introduction and development of the methods and tools of science as we practice them today. Those processes date back to around 1600, coincident with the invention of the microscope and telescope. Before then, truths were whatever seemed right to the senses. Afterwards, and to this day, truth was whatever the verified data obtained by your instruments forced you to believe if your senses otherwise contradicted the data.
Yes. Facts. It is, because we look at quantum mechanics and it makes no sense to us. Quantum mechanics violates all of our presuppositions about the world. All of our intuitive understanding of the world around us is violated by things like quantum tunneling, right? That's super weird. Why do electrons do that? Oh, they have this probability of being in one place or the other, and they're not actually in one place or the other until you really look at them. What is that? Oh, I just saw the eigenfunction. It makes no sense.
This fact means that there's no such misunderstanding on the scale of the flat Earth in the era of modern science. And in multiple places throughout the treatise, He's attaching a number to a physical idea or a physical object. That idea goes way back, by the way. Go back to Pythagoras, famous for the Pythagorean theorem, which we all learned in 8th grade, was it, or 9th grade?
Yes.
Pythagoras was also a philosopher who tried to understand how things worked.
Yes.
He felt, among others in his group, that if you assign a number to something, the number can imbue that object with certain meaning and significance, which means then if you manipulate the numbers, that you gain insight into the objects themselves once you've assigned a number to it. There's a lot of that permeates this document, but it's a long disproven approach to the world.
It's a very interesting approach to the world, though. I will say, like, Pythagoras was very, very intelligent, but obviously he wants to imbue objects he wants to imbue spatial objects with a number because I believe that it fits with his mathematical mind. I think that once you can ascribe numbers to objects, it's very difficult, but you can describe the volume with which a spatial object occupies by its definition, right? Volume is space. And so you could take, like, the length, the width, and the height of that table over there and describe each piece, put it together, and you can quantify the exact amount of space that it occupies. We do a lot of this in calculus, the later ends of calculus, which gets very frustrating, but you can absolutely describe things very accurately through integration like that. So yes, you can take that approach, but I think that it's a false assumption to say that that sphere is a 1, that cube is a 4, that triangle or pyramid, that triangle is a 3, but the pyramid is a 6. It would really be a 5, but so it's like stuff like that is. I can see why you think that way. I just don't think it's correct.
Again, there's nothing wrong with a failed idea. Now, other people know to not do it, right? That has value. If we place a candle in front of a mirror, the measurement of light is doubled, is it?
If we place a candle in front of a mirror, the measurement of light is doubled, is it not? It's not. It's not. No. Because light radiates from a point source with an inverse square law. And the luminosity that you record at a certain point can record. It's almost like you view a point source with a multitude of vectors extending out from every point that's normal to the sphere's surface. The point source sphere surface. And so what you do when you place a mirror in front of the candle, you actually reflect the vectors that would be traveling in another direction back at it. It doesn't double the measurement, it just captures the vector that would be traveling in a different direction. It doesn't double the amount of light. It only increases the luminosity based on the vectors that reach your measurement device. I fail to see how that holds up logically.
It does not measure as only one light source. We actually see 2 light.
No, that's false. That's false. Because if there was 2 light sources, you'd have 2 point sources of vectors approaching the light source. It'd be a different measurement if it was 2 point light sources.
A light meter will show twice the intensity of light.
False. That's absolutely false. That is false.
This is false.
Yeah,
he attacked it so with such vitriol.
It's not vitriol. It's not personal, dude. It's not personal. That's just false. That's false. You could actually set up a candle and do that experiment. You could do that. In fact, people at home, if you want, take 2 candles. Hold up. I've got a candle right here from Trader Joe's. I've got a salted caramel and pistachio candle. I've got this candle. And I felt so good about the delicious smell of it that I bought 2 of them. Look at that. I've got 2 candles. Crazy. It's like they're coming by sea. So all I'm saying is that you could take 2 candles and measure the luminosity at a point, right? You can get a lux meter. Get a lux meter. You could Do the experiment at home, ladies and gentlemen. Go on to Amazon, buy a Lux meter at home, get 2 candles from Trader Joe's, mind you. God, this smells so good. Guys, if you don't already, this is an ad, by the way. If you don't already, get yourself a Trader Joe's salted caramel pistachio scented candle from Trader Joe's. This is one of the best smells I've ever smelled. Anyway, you could take 2 candles, measure and then affix a Lux meter at a point source. Get a mirror and place it in front of the candle and then measure it. It's not twice. It's a little bit less than twice. You lose that extra vectors that would be approaching that Lux meter, because all you get is the points of the sphere that have been sliced and then reflected at that point. It's a far different measurement. It's a far different measurement.
Maybe that's too blunt. What else should I say? I'm a scientist.
No, it's yeah. You said everything you need to. You said everything you need to. This is false, because that is false.
That's what I would tell a colleague. A colleague who then say, "Would thank you," and then we go out for beer after, because that's how that works. And there's an old saying. I first heard it from Michael Dell of Dell Technologies. If one day you find yourself the smartest person in the room,
I'm gonna guess he's gonna say, "You're in the wrong room." Let's see. I'll take bets. Will he say that?
change rooms.
Yeah. Change rooms. If you find yourself the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Or change rooms. Change rooms is actually a more succinct ways. That's a succinct way to put that. You're in the wrong room. I like the way that flows. Change rooms, that's more succinct. It's economy of words. You say the same thing with less words. Yes.
I say this is false. The light in the mirror appears dimmer than the source of light itself.
Yes.
For several reasons. Starting with the fact that no mirror is 100% reflective.
Yeah.
But more importantly, the candle in the mirror is always farther away from you than the candle itself. So the light meter will always read less than twice the actual value.
That's okay. First of all, the second part, that makes no sense. So the second part is exactly what I was saying. It's exactly what I was saying. The first part I actually did not mention, and that's a really good point. No mirror is 100% reflective. Some amount of light will be absorbed by the material in the mirror. So it's going like that's part of the reason why if you have a mirror against a mirror, you will have a green tinted image after so many different reflections, because there's this absorption over time of light waves, of electromagnetic light waves, right? There's this absorption slightly over time, and then you iterate that over and over and over again, you're going to get this slightly green image, because that's the only light that's not being absorbed and thus being reflected. It's the green light. It's the same thing why you see any color at all, really, because that is the wavelength that is not being absorbed by the material. So the material is looking like brown, for example, but it's actually just not absorbing brown. It's absorbing everything else. So, yeah.
Of the candle itself. I will note that from this work, Terence produces art, sculptural art, which I find to be intriguing.
That's cool.
Even beautiful. To me, more intriguing than beautiful, because you got to look at it and you keep looking at it. Like, what is that? And what's going on there? I just want to read you my ending comments here.
Yeah.
I could not follow the reasoning on these last few pages, but the illustrations that derive from them are beautiful, regardless of how they were derived.
I think that's a really fair way to put that. I think that's a very, very fair way to put that. He says, my notes have been strongly critical of your reasoning and conclusions. He might get into that. Best to you. See, he's being very, very cordial here. He's being extremely cordial. But yeah, he's literally just saying, I don't know how this follows, but I find your art very beautiful. That's that's a very kind thing to say to somebody. I don't understand why he's reading this with such vitriol. He's imposing all of that emotion unnecessarily.
My notes have been strongly critical of your reasoning and conclusions. I was candid and blunt out of respect for the energy you have clearly invested in this work.
Yeah, candid and blunt. Uh, candid, sure, sure, candid. Blunt, yeah, he's been to the point. He's been very succinct with his statements. I think that that's extremely important, though. You should eliminate all fluff. You shouldn't have a 56 page to a 36 page initial. Like it doesn't. That's all fluff. If you have to coerce someone's emotional well-being into taking your idea correctly, you are manipulating somebody. That is a product of manipulation. You shouldn't manipulate somebody into believing your idea. Your idea should stand on its own. It should be so good. Your idea should be so good that no matter how the reader reads it, they must conclude what you are concluding. That means you've eliminated all of yourself from an idea, and it only stands by the idea itself. If the idea can be pushed over, then that is not a good idea. If you come with a smiling face and you're like, well, come on, like we're really good friends. Just accept my reasoning. It's not, no, that's not good. It never works like that. So blunt is actually very good to use in this scenario.
But if you're sure that you are still right and that I have completely misunderstood your thesis, then you will need to look for another person to evaluate what you have done and solicit their comments.
Yeah.
In any case, like I say above, the images and illustrations in your final pages are beautiful works of art, unlike any I have seen. Best to you, Neil. So, in case people wanted to know what actually went down 8 years ago, just always be cautious of the Dunning-Kruger effect. You put in.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I think he's being very kind here. I think that it's insulting that Terrence would read this so incorrect. But I will say that we are watching Neil's response to this, and we may have not seen something in the original response that he really took concern to. I want to say that there may have been some omission, and there needs to be, right? Because he's made a 17-minute video on this, and he's illustrated different parts of about, I want to say maybe about 5 or 6 pages, but there was like 30 more, right? There's like 30 more pages. So there necessarily has to be omissions. There has to be. Otherwise, this is not going to be entertaining. It'll be completely mind-numbing the entire time. But so he's got to keep this entertaining and only illustrate certain parts. He could have illustrated only the best parts. So, I mean, Neil is a showman. He could have done that. He really could have done that. I don't want to assume that that's what he's done, but I'm saying that that is a possibility and that we do need to look out for that. So just to have that in mind as we go on. But I think that it seems like, given what he said, he's approached this very, very much in good faith.
In a little bit of work and you have an idea, and then you think your idea is right and that Einstein is wrong and Newton is wrong and that everybody's wrong and that all of modern astrophysicists are wrong. That's bold. That's bold. Audacious. Bodacious. When continental drift was proposed, it was like, what? Land masses are moving on Earth's surface? That's a weird idea. That's going to be a hard sell. We think there's sort of upswelling of the, yes, locally, but whole continents, that's crazy. It would take a few decades until ultimately, when we're mapping the bottom of the ocean, we find that there's a mid-Atlantic ridge that the ridges are separating. It's like bada bing. So the resistance to jumping on the idea that continents move was not because people were stubborn. It was because people are cautious. Any new idea needs to be put through the ringer. That's how science works.
Yes.
You put it through the ringer. Every possible test you can, not just because it happens to look like South America fits with Africa. Any better evidence than that? Oh, wait a minute. Fossils matched between the west coast of South America and the east coast of Africa. Not recent fossils, fossils from millions of years ago. That's interesting. Yes. Things that make you go, that brought some more people over to the camp. You keep that up, and you reach a point where enough evidence is brought to bear on the question, and then you have a new emergent truth. But at the vibrant energy that goes on at conferences and the contest of ideas, that's how we roll. That's how it works. When Einstein came out with relativity, saying space-time curves, Al, what are you saying? What are you doing? Well, you can test it with the total solar eclipse. So the idea comes out in 1915, is published in 1916, 1919. We measured light around the edge of a during a total solar eclipse because you can't see the stars during the daytime. You see the light rays bent from their actual coordinate positions on the sky. Sir Arthur Eddington, an astrophysicist, provided the first experimental evidence for Einstein's general theory of relativity, which, by the way, was published in a peer-reviewed journal.
Oh, by the way, guys, did you see the eclipse that recently happened? Oh my gosh. I watched 2 eclipses in my life so far. It's absolutely insane. I've been brought to tears both times. I didn't realize the emotional impact that a total solar eclipse would have had until in 2016 when I'm watching it outside of my, at the time, girlfriend's house. And we have this white sheet placed out, and I'm, taking the day off work. Thank God. And I'm outside, and I took the day out of school too. I like dedicated the day to it because I'm like, this is gonna be pretty cool. Never in my life would I realize that a celestial event can bring me to actual tears. I thought that it would be a real cool thing to watch, like a comet. I thought that it would be like a meteor shower. Like, oh, that's really neat. Look at that. Kind of like Aurora Borealis, like looking at that. Well, I've never seen Aurora Borealis, but maybe that might even have an event. But it's just like when I see the eclipse happen, I can't help but have an insane emotional response where I am brought to actual tears flowing down my face. It was absolutely insane. But yeah, I mean, these eclipse photos just bring me right back to it. And I can tell you that was the most recent solar eclipse, because that's exactly what the rays of light look like during that eclipse. The first eclipse, the lighting looked different. You could tell because it juts out in 3 different directions like this, right? Like a Mercedes-Benz logo. That is exactly what that eclipse looked like. Now, I guess I could be wrong, but I remember this image very, very well. And the first one looked very different. Very different.
Right? The light rays bent from their actual coordinate positions on the sky. Sir Arthur Eddington, an astrophysicist, provided the first experimental evidence for Einstein's general theory of relativity, which, by the way, was published in a peer-reviewed journal. Crazy idea. The platform to be accepted for the ideas is not social media.
Oh, and by the way, when I was talking about Einstein earlier, about how they were proving Einstein right again and again and again, this is exactly what I'm talking about.
It is not Joe Rogan. It is not my podcast.
I don't like
it. It is research journals where attention can be given on a level that at the end of the day offers no higher respect for your energy and intellect than by declaring that what's in it is either right or wrong or worthy of publication or not. I wanted to post this to my website so you can see my comments mixed in with his treatise, but you got the sense of it. Thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching. Neil deGrasse Tyson here. As always, keep looking up.
Wow. What a cool guy. Too good for this world. I like Neil. He can be very showman-like, but I really like the fact that he said he would post everything to his website. That's really cool, because I think that stands exactly in line with what I was saying earlier. That stands exactly in the face of what I was saying. When I said that it's possible that he said something in there, in that 36 pages, that invoked a dramatic response. If he publishes the entire thing, you can't say that. You can't say, well, there could have been something in there we just don't know. We could have isolated. No, because he posted the entire thing. So look through it yourself. I think that was super important. I think that that was a really, really important piece of this response. So good on you, Neil. Good on you, Neil. That was fantastic. That was really cool. I love that. All right, so I'm going to bring this to a close. We're about an hour and a half in, and I think I've said everything that I can on this. So thank you, thank you, thank you for everybody that has tuned in throughout the stream. And these will get better as I do them. I appreciate your patience, and I am trying to find my niche here on YouTube. I have made some absolutely despicable content. If you go onto my alternative channel, Ego, I made some absolutely despicable content. Hold up. Let me share this. Share the screen. I'm going to share it. So this is another channel of mine. It's called Ego, right? And I just wanted to put myself in songs. So I said I'd insert myself in well-known songs and make some of my own. This has just been like a joke account, really. Home of Ego Edits and Ego Originals. My TikTok is called OG Ego, and that was supposed to be my rapper name, and I was going to make these raps in this closet here. The only issue with that is that a lot of people could hear me while I was doing this, so I didn't end up making anything in here except for like just meme stuff. But this was actually my attempt. It was my sofa at the time that was set up with a blanket on the side of that sofa, extending throughout this door. The pillows would be put on this hallway, so it would create the space where no one could hear me, because there was this piece right here. There was my bedroom on the other side of the wall over here, like where the camera is basically like positioned. That's where my bedroom was. So there was that extension out to the window where people could hear me. And then there was the bathroom on the other side. So there was this space in the hallway, the tiniest hallway I could find, with this little sound booth. This tiny little closet. So what I did is I knew that that would be the most soundproof place in my small apartment. So I set everything up to prevent sound from being transferred. Now I did that, and I didn't end up making a lot because I wasn't making a lot of money at the time. And then I got into a relationship shortly after, and it was just like I couldn't dedicate a lot of time to it anyway. But then there was like a relationship that dragged me away from it. So this stuff never really happened. These are just re-uploads of very early content. I've made better content on that channel later, but very early content. And then recently I've been, I came into contact with this AI generator, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And so I've been playing around with it. It actually mimics your voice if you speak into the microphone for about 30 seconds, and then you plug that in, it can
work that room
voice
like a symphony conductor. Get out there, shake some hands, and smile. Next up, let's dive into the delicious world of music production.
I didn't create this script. I didn't create any of these transitions. I didn't create the collages. I didn't create anything on here. I literally just said, make a YouTube video, a 10-minute YouTube video about breaking into the music industry and 25 tips that you can have to break into the music industry. And it made this.
This is where the magic happens. Think of it like cooking up a gourmet meal. Ingredients, spices, and secret sauce.
I think it's still on 1.25, so let me bring it back down.
Mastering EQ, compression, reverb, and more.
I want you to know I didn't speak any of this. I didn't write any of this. And this is what it created.
Producer is like a sonic architect, crafting each layer of sound. Songwriting, the lifeblood of music. It's It's like writing a love letter to someone you've never met, pouring your heart out, hoping to connect with a stranger. I've stared at a blank page for hours.
Okay, I wrote this piece. I've stared at a
hoping
blank
to
page
find
for
some
hours.
inspiration and only walked away frustrated.
I did write that piece because I thought that the original script was lacking in any amount of human connection. Like AI does this thing to where it creates, but it creates something that is completely devoid of any amount of human connection. And so I had to add that so I could connect to the audience. But this is just like,
Every hit song started as a blank page.
not me.
So go on, give it a shot, pour your heart into something beautiful. All right, let's talk live performance. The stage is your coliseum, the crowd, your roaring audience.
I mean, you can tell that this is definitely my voice, but it's not the way that I would speak in a sentence. So like, there's a lot of choppiness to it. There's a lot of weird inflection that happens with the pausing of the sentences. Like, yes, I do pause a little. Like, I pause more than the average person between my sentences, but like that was just blown out of proportion on this. And so I had to many times remove the excessive pauses in here. And it's pretty cool because it will generate this, but it will also allow you to make edits to individual chapters. So if you're like, oh, this chapter doesn't have good pacing to it, make better pacing, and it'll increase the pacing on it. Or it'll rewrite the script where it builds tension and then produces release. Like, it's really, really neat how this approaches things. I don't think that this should be a substitute for making content, but it's a really cool way to understand how exactly this AI model has been trained on creating videos. What do you see across the platforms? I think this is really neat. This is really, really neat. And especially if you can use your own voice, that's interesting at the very least. So I made that, and then I made this absolutely like despicable thing. This is so bad because it starts as like a documentary on this rapper Ego.
The air crackled with anticipation. The year was 2020. From the depths of the digital underground, a new sound emerged, raw and untamed. This was no ordinary sound. This was a revolution. The world would come to know him as Ego, but his story began with a young man named Enrique Gomez.
Like, it's a story about Enrique Gomez, Ego, who starts on the streets of Detroit and like pours his heart and soul into music. And then I edited things like New Testament. Like, it said Testament, so I was like, they're gonna say New Testament. And somebody said Buzz on here, but I really should have updated that to BuzzFeed.
A reflection of his environment, a raw depiction of the streets. But beyond the grit and grime, there was an undeniable charisma, a star quality that shone through.
This is when it gets really
Ego's
bad.
breakout moment arrived with his debut single, Concrete Jungle, Where Dreams Are Made Of. This gritty anthem, a raw depiction of urban life, resonated with audiences across the globe, particularly underage fans.
And I just add stuff like that throughout the entire video to make it like extremely sus. Like, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean by that?
The song shot up the charts.
And it just moves on. Like, it doesn't take a second to reflect on that. It just like, it says it outright and then it just moves on. So it's like, hold up. What do you mean by that? Personally, I find that stuff really funny. I find that stuff really, really funny. But that's just me. Like, obviously, that's a horrific and horrible thing to say. But if you say that and then you continue moving on, and it's like, wait, hold up, and you're not allowed to stop and pause and think about like that horrific thing that was just said, like in the same sentence of he rose up on the streets of Detroit. Like, I don't know. That to me is funny. I like that. Obviously I don't endorse that. Obviously that's a joke, but I mean, yeah. That was an atrocity. So I've been making stuff like that. But as far as my niche goes, I don't know exactly where I fit in. If I'm going to, focus in on actual music creation, if I'm going to actually put myself into songs, I try to make I tried to put myself into Wavy the other night, and I just listened back to it, and I'm thinking like, this is not as a fan what I would want to listen to. And I can't even produce this anywhere. I can't even put this on SoundCloud so it can get on Apple. Like, I literally have to start from square one if I were to do that. And I don't have the right people that I'm working with. I don't have anybody I'm working with. I've reached out to several people to say, hey, I need help doing this. I've never done this before. I don't know how to put myself into a song. And they're like, well, I haven't done it in a while. Or, well, you could pay a producer to get in and work with you, but you need to come with content that you want to create. And it's like, well, I don't exactly know what I want to create just yet. And nobody is there to like really help me out in the interim of that space between like, well, I've never done this before and I don't know what to ask, but I want to make something like a song. And it's just like, it's radio silence from people. So I don't know what to expect. I think I'm just in the wrong place. I'm in Missouri, so there's not a lot of creative people here in Missouri like that. I work with as many creative people as possible. I work with many different groups that are very creative, but like, that's a rarity. That is a rarity. So yeah, that's where I'm at in life. So I've been doing stuff like that, and I got to find where my niche is. And then once I find exactly like, not something that's low production value, but something that I can easily make, that I compulsively want to make, that people enjoy watching. I need to find where those three things come together. The confluence of easily created, I compulsively want to make them, still high production value, but it comes from me without any attempt at all. Like, I am trying really hard at doing this thing. Like, I want to just like look up and be like, oh my gosh, it's 3 a.m. I can't believe that. I've spent all day doing this thing and I've been completely engrossed in it and I love it completely and people love it. That's what I want. And so I don't know what that is for me just yet. And so I'm just going to keep trying and make this channel just a grab bag of different things, try and do my podcast as much as possible and set up for that. But outside of that, I don't know where I fit in here. So I'm going to keep trying different things until I really pop off with something. And whatever I pop off with, if I really enjoy making it, then that's going to be my thing. But I don't know what that is just yet. So yeah, stay tuned for that. I love you guys. Thanks for tuning into the stream. Hope you guys have a good Father's Day. See you, Daddy.